Hi, I'm Mayor Josh Cohen, and thank you for watching this video because we face an unprecedented budget crisis in Annapolis. Yesterday I held an employee meeting at Maryland Hall. Over 250 employees attended, and if you weren't able to make that meeting, in this video I'm going to share with you the main points that we covered. The long and short of it is this unprecedented budget crisis we face is going to be very difficult to get through, but we will get through it. We have to get through it. We're obligated by law to have a balanced budget. The budget deficit we face is projected at $2.6 million through the end of this fiscal year, meaning just to get from now until June 30th, we face a $2.6 million shortfall in our revenues to cover our expenses. Next fiscal year, starting July 1 of this year, we face a projected $6.4 million budget deficit. Since taking office on December 7th, I've moved aggressively to rein in spending, even eliminating some expenses that were previously budgeted and approved that I believe we can do without. You may have read that I've taken back the $27,500 in the Sister Cities program. I've suspended printing of the City of Annapolis magazine, which costs $80,000 a year. Both of those have merit, but in my view, both of those are things we have to do without at a time when we're struggling simply to fund essential services. I've asked department heads to submit budgets for next year that are 5% smaller than the current year, rather than me just taking an axe across the board. I want department heads to identify where they can cut. Employees are a critical part of that discussion. One of the messages at the employee meeting yesterday was that I and the department heads are looking to every employee to identify areas where we can cut back. Where can we reduce expenses on supplies? Where can we save money? I want you employees to share those suggestions with your supervisors, with your department heads, and always feel free to email me directly at mayor@annapolis.gov. I'm going to personally review every suggestion people send in to save money. The 5% reduction for next year does not address our budget deficit within this current fiscal year. The 5% for next year doesn't even fully address the budget deficit we're projecting for next year, but even that won't deal with how do we get from now till June 30th. We're looking at all sorts of options. We're looking at the assets the city has, the real estate we have, if we can do without some of it and try and sell it and not only reduce our overhead expenses but bring in some revenue that way. You may have read that the IDEA teams, the transition team I appointed, 92 people had spent over 2 months reviewing all of the city's operations, recommending short-term specific actions the administration can take to save money. I've asked the City Council as well as my department heads to review the IDEA team reports and come back with their recommendations for specific actions we can implement right now to start saving money. We're looking at the take-home vehicle policy. We're also looking at reducing services to the public, unfortunately. Not only reducing services that are non-essential, but also looking at the fees we charge for services and making sure that the fees are recouping the cost to the city to provide those fees. All of these measures we're taking on the expense side will not be enough to address our budget crisis. Shortly after taking office, I implemented a hiring freeze for all positions with the exception of police and fire, but even police and fire hires need approval from the chief administrative officer before we fill those positions. We've worked aggressively to manage overtime. Overtime expenses have been a very large contributor to our budget deficit, and some overtime is necessary, particularly with these snowstorms we've been having. But what we have found is that overtime was not managed well enough, and we need to get that under control. And I want to thank employees for doing your part to work with your supervisors to help us get that under control, because I know that overtime expense is also take-home pay for many employees, and it affects you directly in your pocketbook. Despite all of these measures that were taken, the bottom line is we cannot get through this budget crisis without concessions in terms of pay and benefits. We are in the midst of union negotiations with all 4 unions. We are asking the unions for unprecedented concessions, both in terms of wages, in terms of health benefits, in terms of retirement benefits. We're looking at furloughs, and we're even looking at layoffs, because despite all of these efforts we're taking, unfortunately, even with significant concessions, it is becoming more and more clear that we cannot get through this budget crisis without layoffs. That layoffs are not only possible, but likely. And once that realization became clear, I wanted to hold this employee meeting to meet with you face-to-face, share with you how we see things, try and put to rest some of the speculation and rumors going around, and just say, here's where we are. I do not know what the precise path is through this budget crisis right now. We're still in the early stages, not only of putting together our budget for next year, but of figuring out how we're going to get through this fiscal year. But even though there's a lot we don't know, I want to open up the discussion and invite your suggestions. At the meeting yesterday, Kimla Milburn, the Director of Human Resources, spoke about some of the resources and services that our Human Resources Department has for all of us as employees. I encourage each of you to meet with your HR representatives. Make sure you are aware of what services the city has to offer, so that all of you are best positioned should furloughs or layoffs happen. One of the questions we received yesterday had to do with the mayor and city council. And absolutely, I as mayor will follow whatever wage concessions employees agree to. If employees end up with furlough days, I will give back the furlough day pay. The city council cannot be required to do anything, but I'm sure that all 8 alderpersons will do the same, because we are all in this together. And as cliched as that sounds, I want to emphasize that point, because the way through this budget crisis is not through one employee group to point fingers at another employee group. We have 4 different categories of employees. We have union civil service employees, we have non-represented civil service employees, we have exempt employees, and we have contractual employees. All of those employee groups provide important services to the public. It's not as simple as saying, well, we're just going to take all contractual employees and cut all of them first. We cannot do that. Contractual employees provide a very valuable service. My goal is to treat non-represented and unionized employees equitably. I cannot commit to that at this moment. There's a lot that is still up in the air, but it's important that all of us not point fingers, but look for ways where all of us can sacrifice together and identify ways that we can all participate in solving this budget crisis. In terms of next steps, I'm meeting with my Chief Administrative Officer, my management team, and my department heads over the next several weeks as I put together my proposed budget for the next fiscal year. I need to submit my budget to the City Council on March 8th. The City Council will then spend a couple months reviewing and making changes to the budget. The City Council usually adopts the budget by the end of May. They have until the end of June, but for practical purposes, they strike the budget by the end of May for next year. So all of this stuff is happening right now. Like I said earlier, I do not know the precise path through this budget process, but I need your help so that we can all get through this in the best way possible. Again, please do share your suggestions. Email me at mayor@annapolis.gov. I ask that you share your suggestions with your department heads. And the one thing I do know is that we will get through this. My goal is to address this budget crisis now. Whether we do furloughs, whether we do layoffs, whether we cut back services, or more likely a combination of all of the above. I do not want to be in the same position next year, and I know none of you want to be in the same position of uncertainty at this time next year. We know what the budget deficit is that we face. We know we need to take steps now to bring our expenses into alignment with our revenues. the good news is we're looking at a projected $80 million in revenues for next year. So city government is not going to shut down. We're still going to provide many needed services to the public. But the bad news is we do face, like I said, a $2.6 million deficit this year and a $6.4 million deficit next year. That's what we need to address now. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your attention. And thank you for listening.